Good morning. It is 8 o'clock, right? It is 8 o'clock. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Oh, is this? Can you hear me back there? Okay. Good morning. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Swine Disease Eradication Center Carlos Pijuan Symposium this morning for 2022. The Swine Disease Eradication Center was an initiative that started 21 years ago under the leadership of Dr. Carlos Pijuan. Unfortunately, for the last 15 years, we haven't had Dr. Pijuan with us, but his philosophy is still among us, and we talk about it. So because of that, today we're bringing to you this topic about biosecurity and biocontainment in finishing pigs, an untapped resource to advance regional disease control. So hopefully today, after all the presentations, you will have information that will help you with that. The idea or our objective today is to present that information that the speakers are going to share and to be able to help producers, veterinarians, practitioners, other professionals in the swine industry to make those informed decisions and making sure that we're going in the right direction towards disease control, which is focused on downstream flows. Okay. For the program today, we will have several speakers. We will have a break. I apologize if in the program we don't have it printed, like we have a break after the first 3 presentations. We will have 3 presentations, and then at the end we will have a panel discussion. I won't keep taking much of your time, but the last thing that I want to do before getting into the topics is to thank our partners in the Swine Disease Eradication Center, not only for the financial support that we receive, but for the support in many other forms. It's in collaborations, it's in ideas, the meetings we have, the brainstorming, coming up with the right questions that can help you do disease control and elimination in the field. So your support is very much appreciated, and this is a project and an initiative that has been running for over 20 years now, and it is a very strong center. So with that, I will start introducing our first speaker for our first presentation. A little bit lost here. Okay. So for our first presentation, we'll have Dr. Montse Torremorell. Montse is a professor in the veterinary medicine at the University of Minnesota, which prior to joining the university had the chance to work in the swine industry in the US for about 10 years. Her research subjects are related to the transmission, control, and elimination of viruses of economic importance in pigs, and she's especially interested in biosecurity strategies to keep populations healthy. So with that, Montse, thank you for agreeing to talk to us today.
Okay.
Oh, you don't need that.
Yeah, I'm going to use this other one. Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Okay. It's very good to see so many of you today here with us. And my job today is in some way set the stage for this morning and to talk about grow finish biosecurity. And I will not talk about some of the challenges ahead, not that I have the answers, but I think that, again, will open the stage for questions and for further research, I hope, and then opportunities to take it from here. Okay, so the first question that we want to address is why to focus on grow finish biosecurity? And to me, there are basically 3 reasons, okay? One is the cost of the disease that it's in the grow finish. I mean, I'm showing the data that Dr. Holcomb generated a few years ago on the cost of PRRS, and for this specific disease, PRRS, 62% of the cost, when those estimates were made, right, Daryl, they were mostly in the grow finish, okay? So even though it's a disease that we think about it's costing a lot of money in the sow farm when we really look at the cost just because the viruses become endemic and stay there for a period of time. The real cost when it comes down to feed conversion and growth is really in the grow-finished pigs, okay? And this is just an example. Other diseases might be the same as well, okay? That's one reason. The second reason, and again, because in part we've done very good job about controlling, in this case, PRRS in the sow farm, is because we've seen the grow-finish pigs are a risk to the sow farms. And I will show you some additional data on this next. But to me, the main important point that I want to highlight as point number 2 is as well that disease in grow-finish, okay, depending what diseases we have and how it comes to be, is really an issue for national security. We got a bit of a glimpse of that when we saw COVID and then the inability we had to slaughter pigs, and then the things that we had to do for a period of time to in some way dispose of those animals that couldn't reach to market. It's not exactly the same, but we got a taste for what it would be to have to deal with measure, in some way, the populations in grow-finished pigs. So I look at it as well that if we don't pay attention to what happened in grow-finished pigs, could position us or make us very vulnerable to diseases, and I'm thinking foreign animal diseases and more. And the last one, really, we don't think often about this, but 92% of the pigs in the US are grow-finish, okay? From about, and it's 66 million as the last estimate on the market report that was published in June 2022. So if we really think about it, 92% of the pigs are in grow-finish, and we do very little. We do things, right, in grow-finish, we do. But at the same time, when we really think about where we put the efforts, we are not putting a lot of the effort where the bulk of the animals are, okay? So those are the 3 reasons to me that we have to, and there are others, obviously, but those are 3 that I just want to bring to your attention to help frame the discussion. I want to talk a bit more about the evidence, about what's the evidence that grow-finished pigs are a risk to sow farms. And in part, I want to start with this slide from the Morrison Swine Health Monitoring Project. Dr. Morrison started this project, and now it's led by Dr. Cesar Corso, about tracking disease incidence of PRRS and PED, mostly in breeding herds. And when we look at this data, which some of you might receive the report on a weekly basis, basically it's telling us, when you really, and this is data now for what, 12, 13 years, it's basically telling us that the incidence of PRRS infections range between 20 to 30%. There are a couple of years in which it's up to 40%, but by and large, when we look at it as a whole, we haven't really made a lot of improvement or decrease in the incidence. This last year, for instance, ending in June, it's about 25% PRRS incidence. So despite all the efforts of what we are doing in sow farms in terms of biosecurity and so on, which is a lot, what we are doing, the incidence of PRRS infections hasn't shifted as much as what we would like to see, okay? And so I think that's something that we have to reevaluate what else might be going on there. And we see that for PRRS. We don't see quite the same for PED, right? PED, this is the curve when the virus was introduced into the US, the first at the top, 2013. But then the rest, it's more below 10%, okay? It's more than, obviously, we would like to see. But in general, in this case, we see the incidence of PED infection is not out of the roof, but again, still important, right? So there are differences between diseases, but I think to me this is an important point. The other thing, now that we are able to gather more data from more databases, this is the data that is published through the Chick Domestic Disease report that ISU compiles the data, taking consideration diagnostic submissions. It's a bit harder to see in this slide, but basically the point from a diagnostic submission point of view is that there are some trends that if you look at the data carefully, some of the data on red, those are submissions from the win to market picks, they start going up before the submissions for the sows. Okay? Again, another indirect indication that it's possible or likely that what happens in grow finish happens before than what happens in the sow farm. Okay? And there are other studies. This is, for instance, a study Dr. Gustavo Machado and Dr. Kim Wanderwall, in which they've looked at what happens in the neighborhood of the sow farms, for instance. So this is PED data, PED study. Each black dot represents a sow farm, and the circles around the black dot, that represents neighborhoods, okay? The movement of animals getting into the neighborhood. And again, they saw that relationship that moving pigs, grow finished pigs, right next to a sow farm, it increases your chances to having infection. Again, the importance of the neighborhood and pig movement, and in this case, grow finished pig movement, okay? So again, there is pieces of data out there that point at the risk of the sow farm. Another piece of information, and this is data that was presented already in 2018. This is work by Dr. Paul Yeski, some of his clients, his neighborhood in some way. Paul, you may remember this, an analysis that Dr. Jose Angulo and then Andrea Ruda look at it, to me illustrates a little bit what happens in grow finish. And let me walk you through this slide. So what you have at the top, these first columns, is the sow farms. And this is the monitoring. I think it was about 4 years of data that they had data about the PRRS status of the sow farms, but also the grow finish. And then here, 1 to 18, those are 18 sites where those sow farms send the pigs to, and all of them are within a reasonable area or region, right? And in different colors is what is considered a different PRRS virus. Okay? So if we just focus on the data from the sow farms, and you look at it from the top to the bottom, you will see that there are 4 different colors, but they appear 6 different times. So there were 6 different outbreaks of PRRS in that period of time in these 5 farms. And the same way you will look at the data for the grow finish. So a couple of things I want to highlight on this, okay? So there is, first of all, you see a lot of colors, okay, which is not good. That means just we have a lot of PRRS strains in this grow finish data set. And I would argue that this is a very common scenario about what happens in grow finish, and we may not always have that data, because I don't think we do a very good job in general monitoring grow finish. We were fortunate in this case that Dr. Yeski and his client were interested in understanding what happened in those grow finish and got that data. But first of all, we have a lot of colors, so a lot of different strains and co-circulating strains as well. Okay? In 4 out of the 6 outbreaks, there was this temporal detection of viruses in both grow finish and the sow farm, and we'll see that in more detail in the next slides. Most of the grow finish sites over the period of, I think it was about 4 years, 83%, or 15 out of the 18, became positive at least once. Again, the infections are very common in the grow finish, and we'll see that as well in other studies. Only 3 sites, the 7, 17, and 18, remain negative throughout the 4 years. So we want to know more about what was happening in those sites. Okay? But overall, there was a lot, in this case, there were at least 11 different PRRS viruses identified. Okay? And this is relatively a small system when you really think about it. So, but I think it illustrates what happens in grow finish. So when you look at the weekly PRRS prevalence about what was happening in the sow farms, you can see those are those 5 sow farms. Over time, you can see the prevalence of those, the PRRS prevalence of those farms, PRRS breaks, And then in these crosses, that's when the outbreaks were happening. This is the prevalence in the grow finish. Okay, again, ups and downs throughout the year, but you see a lot of PRRS activity as well. And when you put them together, that's when you can see, and it's hard to point at, but there were 4 out of 6 cases in which there was that at least temporal association. And then with some analysis that Dr. Arruda helped us out, again, we show that association is there. The magnitude, for instance, if you look into some of the analysis here, it showed that a 10% increase on weekly prevalence in growing pigs results in at least 1 increase of PRRS prevalence in the sow farms. The magnitude of the numbers might not seem very high because, again, this is a small data set. But again, I think it points to that point that we are trying to make, that grow finish infections are a risk to the sow farms. Okay? So we want to understand what happens in the grow finish pigs. And we are very interested in getting a better sense about how many are negative and staying negative. Keep in mind that many of the sites, sow farms, we are working you are working very hard on being stable and negative and keep them that way, winning a negative pigs. But then what happens after placement? And I haven't found a lot of data in the literature. Some of this data first is data that Dr. Holcomb had used for his economic analysis on the cost of PRRS. But there is some sites that they stay negative as expected, maybe not as many as we would like to. But the one that I am more interested in is this one, the ones that pigs are placed negative and then what happens over time. Okay? And there are different estimates in this study, at least based on the sampling it was done. It ranged between 25 to 40%, let's say. But we also have evidence or data from others, more non-published, that will argue that depending on where the sites are located, might be 80 to 90% of the sites going back to be positive. Okay? So again, many pigs seroconvert or get infected once they get into the grow finish. So what do we have to do to actually keep them negative, right? That's part of the question. That's what it's biosecurity, right? So I think we need to start understanding when and how do grow finish pigs get infected. Because the risk factors might change. For instance, infections in the earliest stages after weaning, they might have different risk factors that if the pigs get infected later, okay? So this I'm just showing a few things that it's been shown in different studies or as people look into it that could be risk factors for those infections. So again, we need to understand better what happened in those grow finish. Same for if the infections happen mostly halfway or at the end. So again, we'll point at different risk factors which can help us direct intervention strategies. Or are they truly random? Okay? Are the infections happening in the grow finish truly random, meaning thinking, is this just airborne? Can we do anything about it? Okay? Is it just location and we cannot do anything about it? Personally, I feel like we have to look into these things here before we talk about random. And actually, in some of the studies, and Jose will present some of this data later, there doesn't seem to be a random distribution of the infections. They usually seem to be associated with certain events. Okay? And we know as we do these studies, there will be differences between production systems, obviously, and different pathogens depending on how the studies are done. But I think it's a very important thing that we do as a starting point as an industry to start really getting that data and getting the analysis and share it, because there won't be a size fits all. So we need to understand what happens in many of the systems. A bit of a philosophical question I have is that if we, and I don't have the answer, although we have a couple of examples, so if we improve biosecurity practices in grow finish, are we going to really be able to change the incidence of the infection? At the end of the day, that's what we want to do. And I don't know the answer, and I don't think it's an easy answer, but we can find out, I think we can work at finding out that to understand which practices would have the major impact and then how much improvement we can expect, okay? But again, it will depend. And there is a good example. This is a recent publication that the group at CBOR, in collaboration with colleagues at the University of Minnesota, with Dr. Cesar Corso, they look at, or actually they implemented this, certain practices in grow finish pigs, in that case directed at PED infection. They were able to significantly change the incidence of PED infections in grow finish, okay? So there are things that if you do, and in this case was focusing at controlling the indirect transmission, okay, through people, things, and so on, they were able to change the incidence. But for PRRS and other diseases, I don't know, well, whether small changes or changes that we need to do, are we going to really change the incidence in the infection in the grow finish and in the sow farm? I don't know. I think there are things there that need to be answered. So in terms of challenges, again, biosecurity, I'm not saying here anything new. You know that. But the challenge really, in some of the things we talk about in biosecurity, do we have the discipline? Okay, when we say implement a protocol in which you have to change your clothes going into the farm, something as simple as just washing hands. If you move between the sites, do we have to the discipline that then it will happen all along, okay? So I don't know. But that's the challenge that we have ahead for us, even on that implementation of very basic things that we know they work for biosecurity. Can we get it done all the time? So I think that's one of the challenge that we have to think about it. Then obviously we always think about cost, right? It's a costing. Well, to me, it's more than just a cost, okay, that investment on biosecurity. It's also that we have to change behaviors as we make those investments. And I will use an example that it's not biosecurity related, that to me was kind of an interesting, simple example that proved the point that you really have to work at changing the behaviors of the people. I was in a small meeting, about 20 people, about a month ago, and I remember the way how we were sitting around the table. I couldn't see everybody's face, right? And that bothers me because I like to see people's face when people talk. So I asked, can we change the setup of the tables? And we did, so we made the table a bit bigger circle, so we had the break. And when we came back, 80% of the people sat exactly at the same place where they were before the break, okay? So I couldn't still see the face of the people, but that's something very simple, right? And only 2 people, I think, move spaces that then we could see it. But I want to make the point about sometimes we change the infrastructure and we change and invest, and it's a lot of money, but then we really don't work about changing the behavior. And I think biosecurity, it's a lot about changing the behavior or the behavior practices associated with that, okay? Some other challenges that we cannot ignore, labor availability. We know we have challenges with labor availability, just things as simple as getting people to feed the pigs. And simple, the other day I was talking to a large production system, said, well, you can ask all what you want about washing trucks, for instance. Well, we don't have enough drivers to drive the trucks. So then how can you actually ask them to even wait and do the washing when our challenge is just having enough drivers to just move the pigs, right? So that's something I believe it's a big challenge. And that's something we need to think about it. How do we develop protocols that in some way address this issue? And then the other thing is about the structure of the industry of systems between contract production and own production. And because sometimes we think, oh yeah, we'll tell them to do all these things and they will do it because we communicate within the structure of the company. But many of these production systems have also are under contract agreements. But even the person then that takes care of the animals, it's even more detached from that communication, trying to communicate and what practices are done. So I think those are things that we have to consider when we think about implementing or biosecurity. So it's more complex than just saying you have to do X, Y, and Z. And again, I mentioned this before. I mean, I don't think we know very well whether it's like changes in grow finish biosecurity, will it really result on quantifiable benefits, whether it's in the incidence of disease, in the grow finish, or regionally. Or do we really need to go all in? Meaning, do we really need to have grow finish biosecurity that it's almost as extreme as in a sow farm? Or can we get by having a handful of very well done biosecurity practices? And I think that's part of the discussion today as the other presenters will be presenting. So in some way, perfection should not get in the way of good, and get going with this. So some of the opportunities I see in terms of research, again, understand movement of what's going on in those grow finish. I don't think we know very well how pigs are moved. Pigs, I think, is the easy one, actually, for the grow finish. You know when you win, you know where they go, and when they go to the market. But then the movement of people and just things around. I don't think we know exactly what happens in grow finish. And again, Jose will present some of that data in terms of the risk factors. But there are new technologies that they can be applied to find out more, okay? We have to quantify what are the biggest risks, review the processes, and try to keep things simple. And again, one of the areas where I think we have an opportunity, because even though we do a lot of testing in general, I think we have to do a better job understanding what happens in the grow finish populations, okay? I also feel there is an opportunity, and I'm actually very encouraged by even the discussions in the last couple of years that happened, and more recently on the subject, and even the proof is today in this room, the fact that we have a session dedicated to grow finish, right? I mean, I'm very convinced, and we saw that before, and in particular, I think it's the US culture, that if we put interest and focus on an area, we will able to see a shift in the actions, and we'll make progress, okay? My only concern is that in some way, we may not have a lot of time ahead of us, so we cannot really think about, oh, we'll do this in 10 years. We have to start and get it right. If we think about the risk of diseases like African swine fever and so on. But I also think I'm encouraged by the efforts on the swine health improvement program that, again, helps to tie this. And more recently, just the funding, right? I mean, you can see there is a lot of questions. It's very nice to see the efforts led by the Swine Health Improvement, Swine Health Information Center and the FAR and the National Pork Board to try to put some funds to really help answer some of these questions. Because I think if all of us work in collaboration, we will be able to shift the needle. So what will it take? I will just say we've come a long way. When you really think about, in retrospect, all the things we've done in the sow farms, we've done a lot, right? Nobody, I mean, if we had a meeting, let's say 20 years ago, and somebody would have said, in the next 20 years, you would do all this in a sow farm to keep them negative, I'm sure there would have been a lot of pushback. Say, no, are you kidding me? We have to now filter and do this and do that. But when we look back, we've done a lot on the sow farms. And the question is what it will take for the grow finish. Again, I think we know to a certain degree what it needs to happen, but making it happen, it's really the question and the spirit of today's session to start the discussion. So with that, again, my intention was just to set the stage and look forward to the other presentations. So thank you.
Thank you, Montse. That was a great way to, organize the session, certainly, and start making us start think about, how to get those things done. Are there questions from the audience for Montse?
Thank you. This might be a philosophical question, Montse, but let's say tomorrow there's an outbreak of ASF, right? When it comes to biosecurity and biocontainment, what happens? I mean, as an industry, are we ready for that here in the United States? domestic, where we're at right now?
Yeah, that's a whole, I mean, some of the immediate things that will happen is to stop the movement of the animals, right? So, and there are all these plans that producers and the states are getting ready for it. More to your question, I think what happens at the site level. Obviously, we'll go back to implementing some of the very basic things, right? Don't share things between sites. Don't people focus on the things we have to do, right? But what it will take, it will happen like in PED, right? Once we understood when PED came in the US, we did better job at washing trucks or at preventing the movement of people, right? So I think immediately some of that will happen. But the point I think I want to drive here, it's more about we have to do a better job planning for it, okay?
I mean,
so.
That was kind of your point, I think, on that one slide is we don't have a lot of time, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this could happen at any point in time. Yeah. It could be now. A lot of different diseases, not just
That's right.
swine fever, right? And is there a plan, I guess, across the major pig-producing states for what does that rollout look like to every size farm?
Yeah.
Right? Because we don't just have big operations. We have smaller pasture-based operations.
That's right.
That might even be at higher risk.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So some of those dialogues are taking place in the context of the secure port supply, the U.S. ship. I mean, but as you said, it's complex discussions, right? But I think the good thing is that the industry is moving that way, okay? And it might not be perfect, but I think the industry is moving that way. Thank you.
Montse, well, along the same lines of the time that we don't have, but more from a historical perspective, and maybe this is politically incorrect to ask, right? But you've been working in biosecurity for a while, and you have seen where we got to, regarding sow farms. How long do you think it's going to take us to get to the point we're at with sow farms in finishers, if we're starting?
I think there are some systems are already there. I mean, so I think it depends on how you want to look at it. I mean, it's not like we are not doing things. I mean, Definitely. As an industry, there are things being happen, but sometimes to me it's that attention, right? So there are companies already that they put more truck washers or that they move to composting on site, for instance, instead of rendering. So there are things that are happening. It's not like we don't not happen. But I think to me it's, again, putting that attention and then bringing everybody along, because you may be doing very well as a company, but if you are in the middle of an area that then nobody else is doing it, then you are still at risk, right? So I think this has to be more of an industry focus, not just a single producer focus. But I think we are going that way. And I think part of what will come out from the research that SHIC and National Port Board will be funding is help attention to some of those things and help maybe with the prioritization on some of those things that need to happen. So I hope that's what it comes up. But Daryl will tell you more about it in the next presentation.
Good. Any other questions for Montse before she leaves? Okay, perfect. Thank you, Montse. Thank you very much.
Actually,